Good morning. It's okay. What's wrong? It's okay.
Good morning, everybody. Please take your seats so we can start this new day. Hope you had a good night sleep and a leisurely evening. So today we really want to speed up the process a little bit. So we start immediately. And we start with agenda item 4 on the replenishment report. So please take your seats and I will introduce the replenishment report, and we will continue the agenda as we indicated yesterday. So after the replenishment report, we go immediately to the next terms of reference for the quadrennial, and then we follow the rest of the agenda. Agenda item 4, report of the task force on the replenishment of the multilateral fund. At the last MOP, we took the decision 28/2 that outlined the terms of reference for a study to be carried out by TEEP on the funding level for 2024 till 2026. This decision also specified that the replenishment report should be submitted for consideration at this meeting. And I must say it's a little bit peculiar because last year we ended the replenishment negotiations, and this year we are already looking forward for the next one. So, but that was for good reasons. TEEP put forward the report as volume 3. With the title Assessment of the Funding Requirements for the Replenishment of the MLF for the period 2024-2026, and it's available on the portal. And a summary can be found in Addendum 2 of the Secretary's Note, 45/2 at 2, and the full summary is contained in the annex to the addendum. First of all, I would like to ask TEEP Replenishment Task Force to come podium to present the report. And I already would like to thank them for the hard work they put in it and to provide us with the right information. And I would like to thank them for that. And please, TEEP, you can start with your presentation and come forward.
Okay, thank you, co-chairs. Good morning. I'm Xiu Zhang, co-chair of the TEEP Replenishment Task Force. On behalf of my co-chairs, Bella Maironi and Swelly Cavallo, and TEEP Replenishment Task Force, it is my pleasure to begin our presentation of RTF report to parties. Unfortunately, Swelly could not be here this morning, but she is joining us online. The next slide, please. Decision 34-2 of the MOP gave TEEP the TOR for the study on the 2024-26 replenishment of the multilateral fund. And the decision requested TEEP to submit a report to the 45th OEWG to enable MOP to adopt a decision. And the TOR requested TEEP to take into account, among other things, all control measures agreed by Montreal Protocol to allocate resources to enable A5 parties to comply. Next slide. Some additional requests, such as resources allocation to maintain or enhance energy efficiency for gender mainstreaming and to support end-of-life management and disposal of banks. Next, please. And the decision requested TEEP to use a compliance-based methodology and consult widely, as well as provide indicative figures for the future triennium. Next. TEEP therefore established a task force, and the names of the volunteer experts are acknowledged in this slide. We are grateful for the commitment and efforts of our members. We also want to express our sincere appreciation for the support of Ozone and Multilateral Fund sectorant to our work. Next. The 2024-26 triennium represents a significant milestone under the Montreal Protocol, as the multilateral funding will address both HCFC phase-out and HFC phase-down. The RTF estimated funding requirements for this and future triennium take strictly into account the relevant compliance targets within those periods as requested by the decision. And this slide highlights the compliance targets for HFCFC. Next, please. For the funding needs for HFC phasing down, the compliance targets addressed in the RTF report for this and the next triennium are shown in this slide, and both Group 1 and Group 2 parties are addressed. Next, please. The May RTF report of 2023 for this OEWG was based on data and information available to RTF as of April 3rd of 2023, and EXCOM decisions up to the 91st meeting. Therefore, our RTF supplementary report will consider new data available after publication of RTF's May report, for example, A7 data, new CP data, and we'll also consider the decisions, guidelines, and discussions from EXCOM 92 meetings, for example, the cost guidelines for refrigeration servicing sector, and consider also revised consumption and scenarios based on guidance from the parties at this contact group for replenishment of this meeting. Next. TEEP also requests further guidance of parties on paragraph 4 of the replenishment TOR. In addition, guidance is also needed on addressing the challenges to sustainable financial flow in the implementation of CAPES. This guidance can be taken on board in the supplementary report of the task force to the MOP. Next. The outline for the RTF report is shown in this slide. Next. Next, please. RTF added information and more details in the annexes, including the methodology used for baseline estimates and assumptions, and based on available HFC consumption data and the cost decisions as of April 3rd of 2023. Next slide. Starting at Chapter 2 of the RTF report, the following next slides will talk about fundings for HCFC phase-out as requested in the TOR. Next, please. For HCFCs, the compliance target for the 2024 to 26 triennium is a 67.5% reduction from baseline by January 1st of 2025. For the next triennium, 27 to 29, 30 to 32, the HCFC phase-out compliance target is a 100% reduction from baseline by January 1st of 2030, with the allowance of servicing tail, which is annual 10-year average of 2.5% of the baseline, is restricted to servicing during 2030 to 40. And the servicing tail is subject to review in 2025. Next, please. HCFC phase-out funding needs are addressed separately for the consumption and production sector. For the consumption sector includes approved HPMPs, project preparation costs, estimated HPMPs, energy efficiency, verification, and technical assistance. And for the HCFC production sector, the funding covers project preparation, including audit, HPPMPs, including verification. Next, please. For the HCFC consumption sector, RTF, in consultation with the Multilateral Fund Secretariat, look at the funding tranches for approved HPMPs agreed until 2031, which totals $137.4 million US. For 2024 to 26, RTF used the approved HPMPs tranches of $116.7 million US as of 91 EXCOM meeting. Next, please. The RTF has calculated the projected funding based on the incremental reduction targets for each country, based on its baseline, starting point, cumulative reductions, and remaining eligible tonnage. RTF considered the cost needed to reach the reduction targets of 67.5% by 2025, 80.5% by 2027, to get a 100 reduction by 2030, with a total $205.4 million US, including the supporting cost. The projected funding only takes into account the percentage needed for compliance based on agreements between EXCOM and the country. No other factors, such as business plan figures for future stages, were taken into account. Next, please. Informed by the Multilateral Fund Consolidated Business Plan for year 2023 to 25, RTF estimates the funding requirements for this period as $170,000 US for project preparation, $1.77 million US for HPMP verification, and NEO for technical assistance. Next, please. RTF considered relevant EXCOM decisions on estimating funding related to energy efficiency for LVCs in servicing sector, which are highlighted in this slide. Those include MOP Decision 28-2, EXCOM Decision 89-6, EXCOM Decision 91-37. Next, please. RTF estimated funding related to energy efficiency based on Decision 89-6 for LVCs, with detailed in funding tranches and the number of countries in each funding bracket, as well as the funding levels agreed by EXCOM. RTF estimated energy efficiency funding for 24 to 26 to be $11.1 million US, which included support cost for 94 LVCs. Those figures are as of 91st EXCOM meeting and will be adjusted for the supplementary report based on approvals at 92nd EXCOM. Next, please. 7 Article 5 parties produces CFCs, and RTF estimated the funding includes $148,000 US for project preparation for stage 1, and for HPPMPs, US $5.35 million for stage 1, and also $23.23 million for stage 2. The total estimated funding is $28.7 million US dollars for HCFC production sector. Next, please. This slide is a summary table of the total funding requirements for the 2024 to 2026 triennium for HCFC consumption and production activities. The total is estimated is at about $364 million US dollars. Now I give the floor to Bella Manoro, the co-chair of the RTF, to continue the presentation to parties.
Great. Thank you very much, Chi-Chiu. I'll go ahead and continue our presentation. You'll be happy to know I'm almost halfway through our slides. Chapter 3 of our report addresses the funding estimates for the HFC phase down. The RTF used the HFC control measures here to estimate the funding needs in this triennium and the next 2 future triennium. For Group 1 parties, in the 2024 to 2026 triennium, we considered a freeze in 2024 and a 10% reduction from the baseline by 2029. For the next 2 triennia, we looked at a 30% reduction from baseline by 2035. For Group 2 parties, we took into consideration the compliance targets of a freeze in production and consumption by 2028, as well as a 10% reduction from baseline by 2032. RTF, the Replenishment Task Force, estimated funding based on the compliance targets, as we described in the previous slide. Lessons learned, established practices and experiences on the HCFC phase-out implementation, available decisions and guidance from the Executive Committee as of its 91st meeting, and data through Article 7 and country program reporting that was available to the task force ahead of its report submitted for this meeting. Similarly to the categories considered for the HCFC funding requirements, for the HFC funding requirement in 2024 to 2026, for the consumption sector funding estimates, we looked at approved Kigali HFC implementation plans, estimated KIPs, funding for this triennium, project preparation, enabling activities, as well as energy efficiency. For the HFC production sector, similarly, we looked at project preparation, estimated Kigali production phase-down management plans, and activities to support HFC 23 mitigation, including project preparation, approved projects, and estimated projects in this triennium. I'll take a little bit of time on this slide because I think it was the most complex part of our approach to estimating the funding requirement for the Kigali HFC implementation plans in this triennium. We followed these steps. In step 1, we, of course, had to calculate the estimated cost for each country. It was helpful for us to consider them in brackets, as we did in the previous replenishment, based on the HFC baseline consumption in metric tons. We'll talk a little bit more about this. In step 2, we then calculated the HFC baseline, filling in the data gaps where Article 7 data or country program data were available to the task force, realizing that there are available new data that can be incorporated into our supplementary report. In step 3, we applied assumptions for the sector distribution for consumption. In step 4, we then applied cost-effectiveness factors. These were mainly based on available information discussed at the 91st XCOM, realizing that at the 92nd XCOM progress was made on some of these sort of sectors for cost-effectiveness. As a last step, we then calculated the cost to get to the 80 and 85 phase-down reduction targets per Group 1 and Group 2 within this and future triennium. And we applied, same as in our previous replenishment, a low and high end scenarios based on the status of Kigali's ratification. This slide just illustrates the country brackets we were discussing and why it was helpful for us to consider the cost estimates this way. We know that particularly for the 94 LVCs, there are different funding decisions that apply. As we previously did in our previous replenishment, we again considered a range based on a low-end and high-end scenario. For the low-end scenario, we took into account 104 Article 5 parties that had ratified the Kigali Amendment as of early April 2023. For the high-end scenario, we took into account that all 144 Article 5 parties would ratify the Kigali Amendment by 2026 and would be eligible for funding. This slide shows the step for calculating the HFC baseline based on the formulas agreed by parties, showing the HCFC as well as the HFC components. This was done for each country, but here in the table we show them according to the brackets. For the HFC portion of the baseline, we used what was available to the task force as of April 2023. We used Article 7 data, if that was available for 2020 through 2022. And we used Article 7 data over country program data where not full Article 7 was available for that period. And we reconciled the differences in the two reporting. Some reporting is done in terms of refrigerant components or HFC components, and some are reported in terms of blends. So we had to be able to look at the data in a comprehensive way. And then any gaps in data, we used the national GDPs to sort of grow and fill any of those gaps in data that was not available. We would recognize that there have been new Article 7 data reported, and we'll take that into account when the replenishment task force updates in its supplementary report. For the step where we applied cost effectiveness factors, particularly for brackets A and D countries, in the absence of final HFC cost guidelines, we used different cost effectiveness factors for these sectors. Some were as a result of experience and cost effectiveness factors used for the HCFC, phase-out management plans. Some were from discussions ongoing at the 91st Executive Committee meeting, and some were previous cost effectiveness factors used in previous TEEP reports on replenishment. We will certainly update these figures based on discussions here, as well as decisions taken at the 92nd Executive Committee meeting. For bracket E, LVCs, the costs are calculated differently. As per the current practice, it represents a summary of some of the discussions and the proposals discussed at the 91st Executive Committee meeting. We considered the average cost of proposals from that meeting to cover the 94 LVCs and came up with this estimate. But certainly we will take new information from the 92nd meeting into consideration for updated cost effectiveness values, which were agreed for the servicing sector at the 92nd meeting. This slide shows the distribution of compliance target reductions that the RTF used to estimate the funding for 2024 to 2026. This goes through the full course of the phase-down targets. After completing the previous steps of calculating the baseline, applying the sector distributions, and the cost effectiveness factors, we then applied these compliance target reductions. I'll maybe give a couple of examples. For Group 1, the 10% reduction target is assumed to be equally distributed over 5 years for implementation between 2024 to 2028 to reach the 10% reduction by 2029. For Group 2, we're looking at future triennia, and we're looking at equal distribution of these reduction targets over a 7-year period to get to the 10% reduction by 2032. This percentage is then multiplied by the total cost, HFC cost per country in that year to calculate the estimated costs for the particular year, grouped together for the triennium, and then the low and high end scenarios were applied to provide the range. So for the 2024 to 2026 triennium, the estimated funding for the Kigali implementation plans is provided in this range from 406 to 449 million US dollars. Since many countries have already received funding for a KIP project preparation, the RTF's estimate was informed by the most recent multilateral fund business plan, totaling 3.2 million US dollars. XCOM Decision 7946 provided levels of funding for enabling activities meeting eligibility requirements. This included ratification and/or letters of intent submitted to the MLF Secretariat. For enabling activities, and as of the 91st XCOM meeting, some countries still had not accessed these funds, even though they were eligible to. So for this triennium, the RTF estimated $1 million US dollars for funding for enabling activities, which can be revisited as part of the decisions taken at the 92nd XCOM and considered by the task force in its supplementary report. The terms of reference for the task force included the need to allocate resources for activities to maintain and/or enhance energy efficiency while phasing down HFCs. Executive Committee Decision 9165 established a funding window for pilot projects in the amount of 20 million US dollars, with the possibility of augmenting this funding at a future meeting. So the RTF considered a total of 20 million US dollars being applied for this triennium. The task force did not estimate future funding in future triennia for energy efficiency, pending further guidance from parties on this. Our term of reference also requested the TEEP to look into the need to allocate resources for supporting activities related to gender mainstreaming as part of the gender policy of the multilateral fund. The task force held consultations, and these were some of the considerations: that there may be a need for resources and substantial workload to collect disaggregated gender data and follow through on executive committee policies, that there may be a need for implementing agencies and Article 5 countries to add capacity to facilitate these kinds of activities, and recognizing that there may be a need for outside appropriate expertise to support some of these activities. The task force reviewed some other policies and practices with other global funds, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the Green Climate Fund, where in those cases, these global funds are preparing and presenting specific projects for approval and implementation that take into account gender mainstreaming activities as sort of example. And the task force provided more information on these funds in our report. In order to estimate the funding needs related to this activity, the task force looked to the cost framework provided under the Decision 91-6 for end-of-life management and project preparation, which also included data collection and preparation of an action plan. The RTF estimated a funding need in this triennium of 13.6 million US dollars. It did not estimate future funding for this activity and implementation of an action plan, pending further guidance from parties. For the production sector, we considered which follows next, we considered project preparation, estimating for the Kigali HFC phase down production management plans, and HFC 23 mitigation projects. We note that all 5 HFC producers have ratified the Kigali Amendment and are eligible for funding. For the production sector estimates for the 2024 to 2026 triennium, the task force estimated $22 million to support production project preparation costs, as well as phase down management plans, and about $10 million for HFC 23 mitigation project preparation, already approved mitigation plans, and estimated project proposals in this triennium for a total of $31.9 million. This table just summarizes the estimated costs for the HFC phase down for both consumption and production sectors for the 2024 to 2026 triennium, providing a range of $407 to $519 million in this triennium. The term of reference to the TEEP also included the need to allocate resources for a funding window for activities to support end-of-life management and disposal of controlled substances in an environmentally sound manner. The 91st Executive Committee meeting established a funding window for the preparation of national inventories of banks of used or unwanted controlled substances and a plan for the collection, transport, and disposal of such substances. Decision 9166 agreed on a maximum funding levels for project preparation. The task force did not estimate funding for future triennia for implementation of these action plans, pending further guidance from parties. The task force considered that the funding window criteria are applicable to all controlled substances and all sectors, that countries that received previous funding remained eligible, that the historic period for previous projects had been a substantive amount of time, and so that sort of the focus on additional projects now were very relevant. And we also considered the input from implementing agencies that had carried through on those previous related projects. The total estimated costs for preparation of national inventories and action plans in 2024 to 2026 is estimated at $13.6 million for this triennium. The next section presents the funding requirements for institutional strengthening and standard activities for this triennium. The funding approved for IS support has played a paramount role in establishing and maintaining the capacity of national ozone units throughout the 35 years of implementing the Montreal Protocol. The standard activities are part of the administrative cost regime established by the parties to support the implementation of obligations under the Montreal Protocol. These activities comprise the operations of the Executive Committee and the Multilateral Fund Secretariat, including monitoring, evaluation, and treasurer functions. UNEP's Compliance Assistance Program, and the core unit funding for the implementing agencies, UNDP, UNIDO, and the World Bank. In estimating the funding needs, the task force recognized that IS has been increased as of the 91st Executive Committee meeting, is set to be reviewed with effect from 2029 under Decision 9163. The task force also considered the core unit costs are to be addressed at the 93rd Executive Committee meeting, but it had assumed that the UNEP cap, the budgets of the core units for the implementing agencies, as well as the MLF Secretariat would increase by 3% in both future triennia to reflect increases in staff costs. For the 2024 to 2026 triennium, the RTF estimated a cost for IS and standard activities of $121.6 million. The total estimated fund requirements for the 2024 to 2026 triennium is shown here with a range of 975 to 1,000 million US dollars. Our considerations for future triennia included, again, the compliance targets required by parties. For ODS phase-out HCFCs, it's 100% phase-out by 2030. For HFCs, for future triennia, we're looking at Group 1 parties, a 30% reduction by 2035. For Group 2 parties, a freeze by 2028, and a 10% reduction by 2032. This is our final slide presenting the estimated range for the current and future triennia. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this very informative and concise presentation. And I think it gives a good overview what you estimated as future funding and needs and the ranges. Now I would like to open the floor for questions and also substantive remarks. So I would like to combine it, not having first questions and then the substantive remark, but combine them. Please try to be as brief as possible and clear. And also bear in mind, and maybe I'm prejudging a little bit, but I know the habits also of this meeting. There could be a contact group and there could be more in-depth questions asked, so keep that in mind as well. So now the floor is open for questions and general remarks. Please. Who breaks the ice? Brazil, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Since this is the first time I take the floor, I would just like to echo my colleagues from yesterday, thanking the Secretariat and the assessment panels. Presentations in the Q&A yesterday were extremely helpful for us to gather discussions today and throughout the week based on the best scientific knowledge available. Item 4 is one of the most important issues we will have the chance to discuss here in Bangkok. As we all know, the Montreal Protocol is successful because we were able to align strong political will, technical assistance, and enough financing, leaving no country behind in our attempts to implement the protocol. Our open dialogue must reflect this experience and what is necessary for us to move forward. Specifically about the replenishment, we fully support that all measures which impose conditions on the approval of projects within the scope of the multilateral funds are financed within the fund itself and not with other resources whose flows we do not control nor can we predict. In this regard, supporting activities related to gender mainstreaming and energy efficiency should be fully integrated into the resources to be provided in the following period by the Multilateral Fund. These issues have been discussed for quite a long time now, and if we are to address them in the following years, we must ensure that they are also provided with sufficient financing within the fund. That being said, Brazil is quite happy with the very detailed work made by the task force that was able to estimate costs for the different stages and areas related to the implementation of the Montreal Protocol, and we believe the low-end and high-end scenarios provide a solid base upon which we can build, resting on our priorities and parties' capacities and responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you for this very clear and concise remarks. I didn't hear any questions from for the replenishment task force, but now I would like to go to Spain.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Good morning, colleagues. I would like to intervene on behalf of the European Union and its 27 member states We are very pleased to meet again, and we will take this opportunity to set important milestones for financing measures under the Kigali Amendment on HFCs. Being this the first time that HCFC phase out and HFC phase down are going to be financed in the same replenishment, we expect that sufficient time would be dedicated to replenishment issues at this meeting to discuss and better understand future needs for supporting Article 5 parties through the multilateral fund. During the past replenishment period, we provided stable funding for the multilateral fund, which was crucial to enable Article 5 parties to comply with their commitments. We are committed to continuing this approach for future funding triennia with a view to make most efficient use of contributions in the final phase of the HCFC phase-out, as well as the start of HFC phase-down. Similar to past practice, the report of a specialized TIP task force formed the basis of replenishment discussion. We therefore thank the TIP for the documents prepared so far in relation to the replenishment of the MLF for the period 2024-2026. We are looking forward to discuss the presentation of TIF and have several questions regarding the report presented. For example, on the methodology and assessment of activities and scenarios proposed for funding. Considering that the implementation of HPMPs and KIPs are mutually supportive, we are also interested to learn if this was considered in any way. For example, in view of incentivizing early action of limiting further growth of HFC. Additionally, we would like to remark that since the approval of the TIP terms of reference in the 34th MOP, the 92 EXCOM approved the HFC refrigeration servicing guidelines, and therefore some assumption will change. We would also like to thank the members of the Replenishment Task Force for their efforts, in particular for carefully taking into account the decisions of the parties and the EXCOM, without preempting any of the ongoing policy discussion. Finally, Mr. Co-Chair, we look forward to working constructively with other parties and further discuss this topic in a contact group. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. Spain on behalf of the EU. I don't see any other delegations on the list who are asking for the floor. Senegal, Kuwait, and afterwards Kuwait. So first Senegal, please.
Merci, Co-Président. Bonjour, chers collègues distingués délégués. Il y a un point qui est extrêmement important et c'est mentionné ici, c'est the funding requirement for end of life management and disposal. Sur ce point-là, c'est un point extrêmement important. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? C'est qu'avec l'élimination des CFC, ensuite du HCFC, et on va vers la réduction des HCFC, dans nos pays, il y a une accumulation de ces substances. Et que faire? Bon, la suggestion, c'est de voir comment...
Sorry, Senegal. There's something wrong with the translation.
Vous m'entendez?
For the translation booth, it's the translation into English. Yeah.
Oui, je disais qu'il y a un point qui est extrêmement important et qui va nous aider nos pays à atteindre la conformité par rapport à l'amendement de Kigali, et c'est la gestion des stocks. Avec les CFC12, certains pays même en ont aujourd'hui en stock. Et avec l'élimination des HCFC, ce sera encore des stocks beaucoup plus importants. Donc, c'est bien que c'est prévu, mais l'idée, c'est d'avoir des centres régionaux au niveau du continent. Par exemple, zone nord, est, ouest, c'est juste une suggestion parce que chaque pays va stocker. Mais est-ce que ce sera suffisant pour une décision? Donc, l'idée, c'est de refaire un regroupement sous forme de centre régional pour pouvoir gérer cela. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Senegal. Now I go to Kuwait.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank the task force for their extensive work, and I know it was very difficult to build these scenarios and to build a roadmap to have this cost. First of all, I have a question regarding to the composition of RTF, and unfortunately, I'm sorry, it's not a personal issue, but we see in the composition awarding of outside expert, and I see an expert coming from an implementing agencies, and we want to understand what's the aim here. Could we, because this is a precedent happen now, and I want to understand what is the rationale of that one, and if that as external expert or outside expert, maybe in one day can be a party joining the TIP. So there is a little bit of understanding, and we are wishing to understand the aim of having and why it's not other agencies also sharing that issue. Saying that, and then I will talk about that the funding and for the new HPMB need also to have a realistic linkages to the way tranches are submitted. Now the methodology follows a percentage distribution for the new HPMP's reported distribution. With the compliance target, this need to be adjusted. And also realistically, all countries that are coming for HCFC's phase-out plan from now would have 10% of HFCs, like Kuwait. Out of these is very limited time beyond 26 or 25 to finish. So we have to reflect this when the calculation happen. And also I would like to raise the issue that HFC's individual project have to be separately identified for some countries and included currently. It seemed to be only a part of the KIPs, while they could be a part of overall HFC's phase down. As this project would get fully funded upfront, it's happened before. This is need to be separately assessed. The second thing that we wish to see the methodology of the calculation that landed there, because in several places that you mentioned that you refer to the business plan of the MLF 23-25, but you know that 23 was covered in the previous triennium and 26 will be covered beyond that element. So there is a separation done by this calculation or not, and we support also the distinguished delegate from Spain on behalf of EU that we are supporting to have a contact group to discuss, and we have more question and more evaluation there. Before I close my statement, I think that we as a parties have to look to the inflation happen, and we have to also consider the increase as mentioned in the presentation for the implementing agencies and MLF. But I think that Tia put it in a percentage and why it was not in a specific figures if it can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kuwait, and also had some questions for the replenishment task force. Then the US.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. I'm glad to be able to make my intervention after my good friend from Kuwait, Yaqub. I'm a little worried you're trying to get yourself on the replenishment task force. I'm not sure you can present from the podium and intervene at the same time, but I admire your innovative approach. So just a few thoughts to share. We're not going to go into any great detail. We, of course, will save our technical comments for the contact group because I think it's easier to sort through them there. We do have some specific questions, as others have noted, on some of the assumptions and methodologies for both HFCs and HCFCs that we will take up there. I did want to mention a few points. One is that the work that was done to produce the range of estimates to us, it's a bit different, I think, than how we've historically done that. Our own preference would be that the basis for the range relates to varying assumptions on sort of the dollars per kilogram or cost effectiveness of interventions, as opposed to the number of parties that ultimately join the Kigali Amendment. I'll come back to that in a few moments, but that is one thing that we did want to say. And I know the RTF will do it, but I think it is quite important that there be updates based on the outcome of the 92nd meeting. We actually did make a lot of substantial progress in the executive committee. We agreed on financing for LVCs as well as for the servicing sector, and we had, I think, a very positive outcome of adopting our first full-fledged KIP or Kigali implementation plan for the government of Cameroon, and we congratulate them on that. And then I just wanted to say a few words, I think just thinking as this delegation thinks about what it wants to accomplish in the replenishment, and I think a lot of what the RTF has done really lays this out. We need to have sufficient resources to ensure compliance during a time period when we are both phasing out HCFCs and beginning the phase down of HFCs. In addition to that, you know, we did just have, I think, some really interesting and constructive discussions in the executive committee as it relates to a couple of points. One of those is the provision of financial resources for Article 5 countries that are willing to undertake early action, so action in advance of the Kigali schedule. And secondly, on the topic of activities to support maintaining or enhancing energy efficiency during the HFC phase down. And of course, that is a follow-on to the language that we agreed in Decision 28.2 as the accompanying decision to the Kigali Amendment, I believe in paragraph 22. The last executive committee actually made some significant progress in both of these, and I think as a policy matter, we sent a message that for those Article 5 countries that wish to, they can propose a Kigali implementation plan that would move more quickly than the Kigali schedule. And similarly, on energy efficiency, we sent a signal that this is an issue that we are going to take up and try to find a path forward. The reason I mention these is I think we have a real opportunity here in the Montreal Protocol to get even more out of the Kigali Amendment than what we have already achieved in adopting the schedule there. We've already gotten up to half a degree of avoided warming. And from this delegation's perspective, we have a climate crisis we're trying to deal with. We fully understand, listen, everybody has agreed to the obligations that are set out under Kigali, and in many ways they're quite ambitious. Just to say from this delegation's perspective, we certainly see an opportunity for front-loading financial resources to help countries be more ambitious in their efforts on climate as they implement the Kigali Amendment. So the replenishment outcome is going to need to reflect that from our perspective. And then I do just want to come back briefly to what I mentioned on the number of countries ratifying. I think for us, the concept would less be that that is a range, and it is more that the replenishment needs to ensure that there is adequate money in the next triennium so that we have financial resources to support Article 5 countries who have not yet joined, but who will join over the next 3 years. And to be clear, as a policy matter, the United States is strongly encouraging of all countries to join the Kigali Amendment. I believe we're at 150 parties. Maybe it's a little bit more now, but last I checked it was. That's a remarkable accomplishment since 2016, but obviously our hope is additional countries will join. And then finally, I would just say, we'll get into the details later, but I think from this delegation's perspective, we need to be strategic as we think about this replenishment. I think we need to be strategic in what we mentioned before, in that we can and should do our utmost to maximize the climate benefits of Kigali Amendment implementation. And I think we also need to be thoughtful about the future. This triennium and the next triennium are both going to be quite challenging. Article 5 countries are they're coming to the end of the HCFC phase out. They're starting up an HFC phase down. And I think it's complicated. It's a lot of work. And I think certainly for us, when we adopted the Kigali Amendment, when we looked at it, it was sort of this 6-year period now that we foresaw that it was going to be a difficult time period, and certainly a time period where we expected that additional support for Article 5 countries would be needed to ensure that we have the assistance to ensure effective implementation on both HCFCs and HFCs. So we look forward to the discussions here. And as I said, we will take up our more detailed comments and questions in the contact group. Thank you.
Thank you. I first would like to give the floor for the replenishment task force to reply to some of the questions that were asked. And then I would like to go to a second round with statements and questions. And then I would like to conclude how we proceed further. And for the second round, I have India, United Kingdom, Nigeria, and Canada on my list. And then I would like to close the list, and more questions could be asked also in a contact group, as was requested by some delegations already. But first, the replenishment task force to reply to some of the questions.
Thank you, and apologies for parties for taking a little bit of time. I'll go ahead and start to answer some of the questions that we heard, but I think mostly we appreciate the statements that were made in support of the task force's work, as well as look forward to the discussions in contact group and additional questions there. I think there was a clarification requested by Spain representing the EU on consideration by the task force of some coordination or incentive to coordinate activities within the HPMPs and the KIPs. It was a specific request in the terms of reference, and one that we're actually seeking guidance from the parties in terms of how to consider that more, essentially in our supplementary report. Given the late stage of where we are in HPMP implementation, we saw limited opportunities there currently, as many of those projects have really been approved and are on the way to being implemented to make the phase out. So we wanted some clarification there in terms of what more could be done in terms of those late stage activities as the KIPs are also being prepared. There were a number of questions, I believe from Kuwait next, that we wanted to sort of discuss, and apologies if maybe some of the questions we weren't completely clear on. There was a question in terms of the composition of our task force, including an expert from an implementing agency. So TEEP considers the experts that it needs for the work requested by parties. I think parties have provided confidence in us to manage the affiliations of experts. We're really looking for their expertise. So we try to have within the task force, as well as within the talks and the TEEP itself, the experts that we need to provide that information. And then when we, recognizing, sort of their sort of affiliations, but really tapping them for their expertise. So we were mindful of the affiliations of not just that, but other experts. And in terms of their contribution to this task force, we're mindful that they were contributing in a way that didn't raise sort of conflicts with, or raise questions or perceptions in terms of how they were contributing to their work. And happy to discuss any concerns there with any of our experts on the task force. I think there were a question about needing to understand when we say that we were informed by the Consolidated Business Plan 2023 to 2025. I think recognizing that previous replenishment was 2023, I think we used information from the business plan relevant to the triennium. So things in the business plan covering the beginning of this triennium 2024 to 2025 were very helpful to inform our considerations for this triennium, especially those plan project proposals. Are there other questions? I think those, I'm sorry if I missed some of the other questions, but happy to discuss directly with Kuwait to clarify anything that in our methodology that wasn't understood. Thank you.
I assume you're ready with answering the questions, Bella? Okay, thank you. Then I would like to give the floor to India for this second round, and then I would like to wrap up. India, please.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. And we thank the Replenishment Task Force for presenting the report, a very comprehensive presentation indeed. Mr. Co-Chair, we will make some broad general comments here at this point in time, while we do have some specific detailed-wise, chapter-wise comments which we would be making later. So our broad comments are as follows. The funding for new HPMPs need to have a realistic linkage to the way the tranches are submitted, rather than the percentage distribution for the new HPMPs. Secondly, all countries that are submitting HCFC phase-out plans from now on are likely to have 100% phase-out, and the HCFCs beyond 2026 could be very limited. So this needs to be reflected in the analysis of the replenishment task force. My next point is that we would like to understand from the replenishment task force how freeze has been addressed in the estimates for both Group 1 and Group 2 countries. Now, I have a point on the energy efficiency component. So we would like to understand the basis of funding proposed for the energy efficiency component when the EXCOM is having decisions for cost funding for energy efficiency. While we would talk about this in more detail in the contact group, it would be useful if the replenishment task force, considering the discussions in the EXCOM, could have a scenario on likely number of industries that would be submitting projects related to energy efficiency under stage 1 of the Kigali implementation plans, including the individual projects. Next, funding needs for installation and assembly in different applications, particularly for small and medium enterprises, needs to be addressed in view of the ongoing discussions we have in the EXCOM, and projects could be considered in the next triennium. The realistic level of HFC servicing needs to be assessed, especially for the non-low volume countries. most of which have both the manufacturing as well as the servicing, and where HFCs are likely to be lower in servicing and higher in manufacturing. So a sensitivity analysis on this could be very useful. Also, we would like to point out that the EXCOM agreed cost effectiveness thresholds, including the related support costs, should be appropriately reflected in the report. My last point is, keeping in view the spirit of transparency and sharing of information, we would request the task force to share the details of calculations with the parties, perhaps in the form of annexures or in the form of Excel sheets as part of the report. This would facilitate parties to do analysis of issues that will and are likely to arise in different scenarios, through which the discussions in the contact group can be very meaningful and more productive, besides improvising the ideas on different funding elements. My last point is that we do support the points made by the distinguished delegate from Kuwait. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you for being so concise and with some clear questions to the TEEP replenishment task force. Then the UK.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. As this is the first time the delegation from the UK is taking the floor, we'd first like to thank the Secretariat for organising the meeting and the Government of Thailand for hosting us in the beautiful city of Bangkok. The UK would first like to thank the Replenishment Task Force and the TEEP for their timely preparation of this comprehensive document. We appreciate the time spent on it and the wealth of information contained within. The UK recognises this as a very key year for replenishment, as the Multilateral Fund begins to also fund the phase-down of HFCs during this replenishment cycle. We had a few queries and clarifications for the TEEP, which I will briefly outline here. Similarly to the US, we are concerned over the small range provided within the report, when the task force has noted throughout that they have been working with highly unknown numbers. We feel different numbers could have been provided for the low and high end, other than just the number of countries that have ratified. We also noted that some data needed to calculate the HFC baselines is only due in September this year. However, we understand from the presentation just given that these can hopefully be incorporated into the subsequent and updated report ready for the MOP. Finally, in response to the query around paragraph 4 and the need for some further clarity, we believe that the TEEP has understood the request we put out correctly. We would like to see further information on how we can simultaneously address the last stage of HPMPs and stage 1 KIPs. We think there is an opportunity to maximise on these synergies, which have currently not been factored in, and would welcome some discussion around including the consumption and servicing sectors also. We are happy to follow up with more clarity if needed. We look forward to discussing this further and support forming a contact group throughout the week. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Nigeria then.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I would like to first of all thank TEEP for this difficult task of coming up with the funding requirements for the 2024 to 2026 replenishment. The areas considered in this in determining the estimate appears far-reaching in the absence of cost guidelines at the time of preparing the report. Noting that the cost guidelines for HFC phase-down was finalized at the last ESCOM meeting, I would like to know what is the implication vis-a-vis the cost estimates in the TEEP report. Thank you.
Thank you. Very clear question. Canada?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We'd like to join other delegations in thanking the TEEP's RTF for its report. As Article 5 countries enter the compliance period for HFCs, while at the same time finalizing the phase-out of HCFCs, and possibly address new issues such as energy efficiency and the disposal of controlled substances, Canada is mindful that continued strong and effective support from the Multilateral Fund will be needed to assist countries in meeting their compliance targets and objectives. In that regard, we think that the RTF report addresses all the key areas where support will be needed in the next replenishment period and provides a good basis for initiating discussions on this issue. One element, though, that we would seek clarification from the RTF and confuse us a little bit in the report is that the executive summary and the introduction indicate that only the HCFC target in 2025 and the HFC target for Group 1 countries in 2029 were considered in the funding estimates for these substances in the 24 to 26 replenishment period. But actually, as we dug into the report and as we saw it in the presentation, we saw that the RTF also included funding for countries to make progress towards the 2030 HCFC target and the 2032 HFC target for Group 2 countries. At least some funding was included for these targets in the year 2025 and 2026 in the tables that were prepared for the report. So unless we're missing something, maybe this is just an issue that needs to be corrected in the introduction and summary in a supplementary report. With respect to the overall estimated funding requirement itself, at this point, we're not sure if it's at the appropriate level. For the time being, I will note that there are several instances where the assessment and the analysis could be strengthened. And just to provide a couple of examples, because I see that as previous speakers are saving their more technical comments for the contact group. However, we do think that there's a couple of issues that would be worth pointing out at this stage. And these are particularly with respect to the methodology that was used for calculating the funding needed for the HFC phase down. Now, the RTF uses an approach of calculating funding to reduce HFCs based on the total quantity in CO2 equivalent of both the HFC and HCFC component of the baseline, instead of actual consumption of HFCs. And we think that approach should be reviewed. It assumes that the consumption that will be funded in all countries is essentially equal to the maximum that is allowed under the baseline. In the case of HCFCs and CFCs, that may have made sense because the baseline was basically representative of the actual consumption of these substances. But of course, we have to remember that in the case of HFCs, the baseline also includes not just the HFC consumption, but in some cases, a very significant element, which is the HCFC component. And the HCFCs are funded under HPMPs. So in most cases, the actual amounts and quantities that are considered there are much higher than the actual HFC consumption in countries. Not in all countries, but in many countries. And while this consumption will grow in countries over the next few years, we have to keep in mind that at the same time, the Multilateral Fund will start funding phase-down plans in these countries, which should help those countries restrain the growth to a significant extent. So therefore, assuming that HFC consumption in all countries will grow to the maximum permitted under the baseline, and then we see funding on the basis of this maximum, is unlikely to reflect the reality in our view. Secondly, and still on HFCs, in the case of most HFC consuming sectors, the RTF calculated the funding by multiplying the estimated consumption of HFCs by the cost effectiveness threshold that was either agreed or currently being considered by the EXCOM. Now, we have to remember that the thresholds are not the average cost effectiveness, which are actually used to fund projects. They're just the maximum value that countries can receive for the different sectors. And in reality, if you look at the historical practice, most projects, particularly for non-low volume consuming countries, are approved at a level that is below the threshold. So We think for the servicing sector is different. I mean, the RTF was quite right in using, an amount for the same amount for the servicing sector, because we do fund those at the same cost effectiveness for all non-low volume consuming countries. But for the manufacturing sector, the thresholds are just that. They're maximum amounts, and they're not necessarily representative of what's actually going to be funded. So in previous replenishment reports, at least those before 2020, and that estimated funding for HCFCs, the RTF did not actually apply the cost effectiveness thresholds. They undertook some analysis to determine appropriate cost effectiveness values for the different sectors, or they used average cost effectiveness factors for approved projects in the same sector. So we think this is some additional analysis that would be useful to undertake in a supplementary report. And there are examples from previous RTF reports that can be used to undertake this kind of analysis. Similar to what the United States has mentioned, there has been decisions and discussions going on within the XCOM related to providing support for countries that want to phase down faster than the strict compliance schedule. And as well, there's discussion about providing some assistance to enhance energy efficiency while phasing down HFCs. We would also be supportive of the supplementary report, including scenarios for these two elements. And we can discuss, what would be the specifics of these scenarios, perhaps within the contact group. Finally, we do know that there are a couple of elements where the RTF is asking for guidance from this body. I'm not going to get into that at this stage, but we are conscious, and we noticed that no one responded to that call from the RTF for guidance on a couple of issues, and we're not going to do so, but we do have some ideas on those issues where we share with other members when we meet in a contact group. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. Maybe just to say, maybe I closed the list a little bit too quickly for interventions, but I really would like, because there's some more countries on the list. First of all, I would like to say there will be a contact group, so more technical questions can be asked over there. So I think that's the most important. I would like to go through the list of countries that requested now for the floor, but be brief, be very concise, and think that all the technical questions you also could ask in the contact group. And I really would like then to close it for now. And it's Saudi Arabia, Costa Rica, Burkina Faso, Japan, Tunisia, Bahrain, and Comoros. Be brief, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Good morning, everyone. Since the delegation take the floor for the first time, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia extends the thanks and appreciation to the Kingdom of Thailand for hosting this OEWG here in Bangkok. We express our appreciation to co-chairs, and we also appreciate the efforts of those on Secretariat in preparation for the organizing this meeting, the reports and papers related to this meeting. I would like to thank also the expert of Scientific Assessment Panel, the Environmental Effects Assessment Panel, and the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel for providing the information needed. Since some of my questions were covered by other delegates, I'll be short and I have only two questions. First, what would be the realistic level of HFC servicing? In the past, HCFC component in servicing for non-LVC countries was not fully funded proportional to targets in stage 1. This needs to be carefully assessed. And the percentage for phase down that will come from servicing for HFC would be lower than 10%, and the manufacturing would be higher. A sensitive analysis should be given here. Secondly, in the cost for gender mainstreaming policies, this needs to be carefully thought through and reflected in the RTF report. Currently, no specific activities and costs for specific target results are included. Finally, this delegation supports the previous interventions to discuss more in a contact group on this matter. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you. That was a very nice brief intervention. And Costa Rica.
Gracias, señor copresidente. Siendo la primera vez que nuestra delegación toma la palabra en esta asamblea, hacemos eco de los agradecimientos al Reino de Tailandia por hospedar esta reunión y a la Secretaría de Ozono por los arreglos realizados para que la misma se lleve a cabo. Costa Rica tiene una preocupación que se ve soportada por lo comentado el día de ayer por parte del Grupo de Evaluación Tecnológica y Económica en la atención a las consultas realizadas a su informe, al indicar que el financiamiento es la clave en el proceso de transición a tecnologías que usan refrigerantes con bajo potencial de agotamiento de ozono y amigables con el clima, sumando doblemente beneficios ambientales, siendo los países importadores y de bajo consumo los que requerimos más recursos. Hacemos un llamado a las partes al análisis de las guías de financiamiento, principalmente para países como el nuestro, cuyas importaciones se han incrementado, lo que conllevó a un cambio en la categoría en la que somos clasificados, afectando significativamente el financiamiento al que podemos acceder de cara a cumplir con los compromisos adquiridos en el marco de la enmienda de Kigali. Otro aspecto importante a considerar es el establecimiento de la línea base en el marco de esta enmienda, que se vio afectada por la pandemia del COVID-19, mostrando para nuestro caso niveles de consumo inferiores a la tendencia de crecimiento que se venía presentando, por lo que el congelamiento de las importaciones para el año 2024 será un reto, ya que la línea base en sí misma será menor a las importaciones de los últimos 2 años, teniendo una reducción inmediata en nuestro consumo de un 8% para ese año. Tal como se ha indicado, la enmienda de Kigali tiene una oportunidad grande de lograr un doble impacto en beneficio del clima, pero el financiamiento para este proceso es de suma importancia para cumplir con los esfuerzos que deben realizar cada una de las partes. A pesar de lo anterior, nuestro país mantiene un firme compromiso con este convenio, tal como históricamente lo ha hecho. Muchas gracias, señor copresidente.
Thank you. Then I immediately go to Burkina Faso.
Merci bien, Monsieur le Président. Donc, je voulais remercier aussi le groupe de travail pour les résultats. Cependant, nous avions une question. Dans le cadre de l'amendement de Kigali, nous allons être amenés à utiliser des réfrigérants inflammables, pour ne pas dire que nous avons déjà commencé à les utiliser. La question est de savoir si l'aspect sécuritaire a été pris en compte dans le financement. Merci bien.
Thank you. Then Japan.
Thank you, Co-Chair. This is first time for Japan to take the floor, so we would like to thank the Secretariat and the Government of Thailand for hosting this meeting. And also, we would like to express our appreciation to TEEP for their hard work. We would like to very, very briefly share Japan's position on the next replenishment. Japan fully acknowledges that next replenishment is very crucial because HOC phase down schedule among A5 parties is going to start from 2024. And also, we very strongly hope to maximize the climate benefit of Kigali Amendment. So we would like to support upcoming replenishment for early action on HOC reductions and also improved energy efficiency. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then the last country that's on my list, that's Tunisia. And then I would like to give the replenishment task force the chance to reply.
شكرا السيد الرئيس المشارك. كما أتوجه بالشكر إلى أعضاء فريق التكنولوجيا والاقتصادي تيب على هذا التقرير، وأود أن أتقدم بسؤالي حول ما إذا تم الأخذ بعين الاعتبار خلال هذه الدراسة للفترة 2024-2026 بالنسبة للمشاريع المدرجة ضمن تعديل كيغالي لبروتوكول مونريال. هل تم الأخذ بعين الاعتبار جانب السلامة في قطاع التبريد والتكييف باعتبار التكلفة الباهظة لهذه التجهيزات المتعلقة بجانب السلامة، وخاصة عند استعمال سوائل تبريد هيدروكربونية قابلة للاشتعال؟ مع الشكر.
Thank you. I'm looking to my right. If you can give some answers, please.
Great, thank you, Co-Chair. I think we start with India in this round. So I will respond to some of the questions raised in India's sort of statements. I think which was related to Kuwait's statement, that the funding for new HPMPs need to sort of be different than the specific percentages sort of distribution, because some HPMPs could move faster. So we approached HPMPs as well as the HFC funding estimates based on strict compliance targets. And so those are the percentage reductions for to reach the HCFC phase-out targets as well as the HFC phase-down targets. And but we welcome the advice of parties in terms of this should be done differently to accommodate those that may want to move faster within the funding for this triennium. There was another question from India with regard to the treatment of the freeze for Group 1 and Group 2 parties. For this triennium, 2024 to 2026, we considered for Group 1 the 10% reduction target to get to 10% reduction in 2029. For future triennia for Group 2, we also considered the 10% reduction target for that group following, that would come in future triennia funding to get to the 10% reduction in 2032. There were some additional statements on energy efficient funding, energy efficiency funding, and what the replenishment task force considered. In this triennium, we based it strictly on the decision and the funding window provided within the executive committee for energy efficiency project preparation activities. There was a suggestion, but I don't know if there was a question, that we also consider for non-LVCs some sensitivity analysis in terms of the servicing sector. We looked for parties' guidance on this in terms of what additional considerations that RTF could make related to this specific issue in its funding estimates. There was also a question in terms of if the task force could share the specific information, methodology, spreadsheets, in terms of how it did its methodology and calculations. To the extent that we can, we've tried to put as much of our methodology and our approach and the information that we used in the report. Some of the information available to the task force was more not completely aggregated data and sort of confidential information that informed us, and that was clearly not available, but we are happy to answer additional questions to clarify the methodology and the data that we used for parties within the contact group. I'll turn to the comments from the UK. Thank you very much for the clarification. I think you went a ways to addressing some of our question and requests for guidance in terms of the consideration, some of the consideration of some coordination between the late stage HPMPs and coordinating those activities with the initial stages of the KIPs. So thank you for that. With regard to Nigeria's question, what is the implication to the RTF's assessment based on the lack of HFC cost guidelines? And certainly very challenging, much more preferred to have absolutely clear cost guidelines and data. But we attempted to fill in the gaps in data, as well as refer to historical approaches taken by the parties in the executive committee, where we currently didn't have guidelines, which the executive committee is working on, in terms of some of these other areas. So to the extent that we used historical information and current discussions ongoing at the XCOM, as well as previous sort of experience on the HPMPs, we sort of return to that to guide our work, lacking final cost guidelines. To the comments from Canada, we wanted to sort of, there was a question in the, I think in the executive summary for support that went beyond the sort of triennium, and this particular trend to future triennium. I think our approach there was to, we had to look both at the current triennium and future triennia, and certainly, you know, distributing equally sort of reduction targets covering what would be covered in this triennium and future triennium. If there's an approach that should be different, considered differently in terms of the distribution for what would be covered in this triennium, we're certainly happy to discuss those if there's guidance for us to do that approach differently. And certainly appreciate the areas that Canada pointed out for further discussion. Certainly welcome further discussion and guidance on those areas in terms of sort of cost effectiveness, additional options for our analysis and assessment going forward, as well as considerations for new decisions taken at the XCOM and other things to include in our supplementary report approach. I think there were related questions from Burkina Faso and Tunisia on whether the task force considered the safety issues of specific projects related to the flammability of refrigerants used. We didn't go into the specific considerations of what would be included in project preparation for sector-specific projects. We went into the expected, you know, costs for project preparation addressing those sectors of use. And so those are actually, we believe these are actually considerations in preparing project preparation proposals for specific countries, depending on the challenges and the needed support to be able to make those transitions as part of their project proposals. I think that was the questions that I recall from parties. Happy to discuss more if I missed any sort of comments made here. Thank you.
Thank you for replying to all the questions. And there was from several delegations, there was a request for a contact group, and indeed there can be more questions put forward in that contact group. Let's say the contact group will take place the first meeting during the lunch, and the TEEP replenishment task force will be there as well to answer your questions, and it also would be good if the MLF Secretariat could attend if needed when there are other questions, and they could provide some answers if needed. The contact group, let's say the time and the venue will be announced later, and the co-chairs of those contact groups will be Sergio Merino from Mexico and Alain Wilmert from Belgium. And then I would like to go to the next agenda item for this morning, and that's agenda item 3E. Potential areas of focus for the 2026 quadrennial assessment. Yesterday we heard some presentations of the 3 assessment panels on the reports, and the idea is now to that led to a lot of questions and food for thought from within this room. So probably that will also be food for thought for the next quadrennial assessment. I would like to open the floor now for, let's say, statements and also ideas for the next quadrennial assessment, and then conclude and present the way forward how to go further in this process this week. So the floor is open now for interventions, please. And I see European Union on my list.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And we fully agree. There was a lot of very relevant information presented yesterday. The work in the last 4 years that the assessment panels have reported to us, and we would very much like to continue this work. So to enable this, the European Union has thought of a CRP for the terms of reference for the next 4 years for the assessment panels, and if that is agreeable to the co-chairs, we would like to present the thank you, the CRP very shortly here. It has been made available to the parties yesterday on the portal, so you can also download it and look at it yourself. But just very briefly here to introduce our ideas for this terms of reference. Well, first off, of course, we would like to note with great appreciation the excellent and highly useful work that the panels have been doing, and we would like them to continue in this way. The CRP, first of all, would like to give the timeline for this work so that the new results would be submitted to the Secretariat by the 31st of December 26. So basically the same timeline as we've had for this report that we received, with 4 years down the road. And we would ask then this to be considered at the open-ended working group and the meeting of the parties in 2027, as well as the synthesis report by the 30th of April in 2027. We would then give a couple of instructions to the assessment panels on the way of working, and that would include that they inform us timely of any new developments that might be very relevant to parties in the period leading up, so not wait for 4 years if there is something significantly new result coming up. Also, we would like the panels to involve relevant scientists from Article 5 countries, promoting gender and regional balance. Then the CRP would give more detailed instructions to the to the 3 different panels, and just very briefly for the EEAP, while they would assess the changes of the ozone layer and UV radiation interaction with the climate, they should be looking at human health, the biosphere, biodiversity, health of flora, fauna, and the ecosystem, as well as further on ecosystem services, effects on agriculture and materials, including plastics, for instance, and other matters. And finally, look at the potential effects of solar radiation management. That would be the proposed areas of work for the EEAP. Sorry, there is another matter that we would like them to look at, which is important to us, is the breakdown products from controlled substances and alternatives, in particular any substances that are very persistent. Now, as for the scientific assessment panel, the SAP, we would like to task them with assessing the state of the ozone layer and its evolution, evaluating global and polar stratospheric ozone, including, of course, the ozone hole and any depletion that is apparent. Look at past and projected contribution of the Montreal Protocol to mitigating climate change. An evaluation of the trends in top-down derived emissions and comparing them with bottom-up estimations to see if there's any issues to be detected there. The consistency of reported production and consumption of substances and their implications for the ozone layer. The interactions between changes in ozone in the stratosphere and the climate systems, and policy scenarios designed to contribute further to the ozone layer protection and climate change mitigation, any substances that could be of concern, solar radiation management, potential effects of aircraft, rockets, wildfires, volcanoes, and their interaction with the ozone layer and the climate, and any newly detected substances. So, as well as any other matters of importance to the ozone layer and the climate system. So I'm rattling off this very quickly here, but of course we will hopefully be able to exchange on these matters and explain them in more detail at a later point in time. Finally, on the TEEP, the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel, we would ask them to look at technical progress in the production and consumption sectors and look at especially at the alternatives available, look at process agents and feedstock uses where we don't need the use of controlled substances, at relevant emissions of controlled substances from feedstock and production processes, the status of banks and controlled substances, challenges facing all parties, the impact on sustainable development, and technical advances in developing alternatives to HCFCs. So that very quickly is a run-through of this lengthy CRP, because we wanted to be giving good instructions to the three assessment panels, and we would therefore very much like to discuss the details of this in a contact group with all interested parties. And we would also ask that maybe the three assessment panels could be invited to such a group, because it may be good to have their feedback on some of these tasks that we might be asking them in order to give them a good terms of reference to work on for the next 4 years. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, and also thank you for putting so much effort in presenting already a CRP for the terms of reference for the next quadrennial assessment. Then Cuba is on my list.
Buenos días. Sí, buenos días. Muchas gracias, señor copresidente. En la tarde de ayer hacíamos dos preguntas al equipo de evaluación sobre las capacidades para poder cumplir con Kigali. En este sentido, nos estamos sumando a las palabras expresadas anteriormente por la representación de Costa Rica con relación a todos los retos que tenemos que enfrentar para lograr la reducción del 10%, sobre todo en relación con el tema financiamiento, cual todavía no sabemos cómo será en los próximos 2 o 3 años que tenemos por delante. Con relación al reporte, volvemos a reiterar nuestro interés en tener una idea si ya el estudio está formulado o si hay algo que esté preelaborado sobre las capacidades que tenemos principalmente los países del artículo 5 de cumplir con las metas de Kigali a 2029 y fundamentalmente las alternativas que pudieran existir en caso de que no sea posible lograrlo, para poderlo lograr. Y coincido totalmente con la delegación de Costa Rica que todo estará estrechamente vinculado a la capacidad de financiamiento que pueda proveer el protocolo a los países, fundamentalmente a los países del artículo 5. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Cuba. Then India.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We thank the delegate from European Union for introducing the CRP. We feel that we need more understanding and discussion on certain elements proposed in the CRP. Mr. Co-Chair, over the years, the 3 assessment panels have been doing a commendable job in bringing out the quadrennial assessment reports. And we feel that the 3 panels should focus on areas and issues concerning the ozone layer and implementation of the Montreal Protocol, rather than diversifying the scope by including new and additional areas which are being addressed under other distinct conventions. So against this, we propose the following areas for the 2026 quadrennial assessment. That is, raw material uses as feedstock and input materials, strengthening safety measures for the use of low GWP alternatives, assessment on whether production of HFOs is resulting in fugitive high GWP HFCs, and lastly, strengthening the national implementation frameworks, including those relating to monitoring and reporting, considering the deliberations that took place in the workshop. We will share more details later during the contact group discussions. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, India. And then I would like to go to the Dominican Republic.
Buenos días, señor copresidente. Como es la primera vez que intervenimos en esta reunión, agradecerle al Reino de Tailandia por su acogida y al secretario del Ozono por darnos esta cálida bienvenida. Queremos en el día de hoy apoyar las declaraciones de Costa Rica con el conocimiento de que República Dominicana es parte de los países que van a ser afectados por la disminución en el primer tramo de los gases HFC. Significa un gran reto para nuestro país tener que limitar nuestro crecimiento con respecto a la refrigeración y la climatización en cumplimiento de la enmienda de Kigali. Pero hasta ahora los mensajes que nos están dando es que tendremos que hacer un mayor esfuerzo con poco financiamiento. Las guías que se han estado realizando, los proyectos que se están haciendo, hemos visto que el financiamiento ha sido poco y los retos mayores. Queremos que en el grupo de contacto se tome en consideración los retos que vamos a asumir estos países y el poco financiamiento que tendremos. Queremos, como país, cumplir con la enmienda de Kigali, pero tenemos un compromiso mayor, que es la eficiencia energética, reducción de gases que se usan en la energía, que salen del ámbito ambiental y van a la economía de nuestros países. Esto debe ser tomado en consideración a los fines de que Montreal siga siendo un ejemplo de cumplimiento en la reducción. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And I see China on my list.
谢谢主席。2026年4年期评估将为缔约方开展HCFC 淘汰和 HFC 校检工作提供重要的技术经济参考信息。我们注意到，在2022年4年期评估报告中，很多行业和领域在替代品选择方面仍面临很多技术和经济挑战。替代技术的进展对于缔约方开展受控物质替代具有十分重要的作用。因此，我们建议20264年期评估围绕议定书履约管控措施要求，特别是基加里修正案涉及的 HFC 校检任务，结合相关领域对化学品的评估和管控要求，为相关行业，特别是重点行业和重点领域提供 关于 D 及 WP 替代品和替代技术的评估。在此基础上，在 HFC 削减过程中，如何提高和保持能效，也是第二方关注的问题。我们希望 TIP 在4年级评估过程中兼顾推进能效问题研究。另外，我们也注意到欧盟就此问题提出了 CRP 文件，非常感谢欧盟所做的准备和刚才的介绍。我们代表团对文件的内容有一些具体的问题，比如说各个评估组所开展工作的范围、重点领域和议定书立约义务的关系，以及基于议定书履约要求和政策发展趋势对替代技术的评估，以及对相关行业履约可持续的影响等。我们愿意在基础小组里进一步交流讨论。谢谢。
Thank you, China. And what I would like to do is, I see some delegations on my list. So if others would like to speak, please indicate now, because then I would like to conclude afterwards and also with a way forward. So please indicate if you would like to speak, and then I would like to conclude and propose a way forward. I have now on my list, there are 3 delegations who would like to speak now: Australia, Canada, and the USA. Australia first.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and good morning. Indeed, the panel presentations yesterday and their comprehensive reports that we have received over the last few months give us lots of food for thought, and I think they do point the way to what we wish to look at in future reports. We thank the EU for their draft CRP, and we do note actually that some elements of that CRP duplicate, or not duplicate, but also pick up issues that are being addressed under other agenda items as well. And so I think those coincidences probably need to be looked at more closely in a contact group. One point we would just like to note, and we heard this from the distinguished delegate from China, is the importance of having good information on alternatives to HFCs. But we also note that under Decision 28.2, we have asked for specific reporting on HFC alternatives. And that reporting timeline is out of sync with the quadrennial reports. So I think there's an opportunity for us to think this issue through. I realise we haven't actually come to agenda item 3D because we're doing the agenda a little bit out of order. But in advance of coming to agenda item 3D, we just wanted to flag our interest in exploring synchronisation of reports related to alternatives on HFCs for the TEEP to reduce their burden, but also to provide a consistency in information being provided to the parties. So we do look forward to our consultations in the contact group. Thank you.
Thank you, Australia. And as I requested delegations earlier, if they would like to take the floor, that they would indicate. And I would like to close the list now. Indeed, just coming back to Australia, it's very good that you indicated that there are also relationships with other agenda items, although they still have to come. I have then 3 delegations on my list: Canada, USA, Brazil, and then I would like to conclude. Canada first.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and our thanks to the European Union for proposing CRP3 on the areas of focus for the next quadrennial assessment. We'd like to particularly thank the EU because we had some discussions with them on this issue, and we note that they have made efforts to take some of our ideas into account, so that's very much appreciated. Overall, we think that this CRP provides really a good basis for the terms of reference. There are many paragraphs, many areas there that we support and can probably stay as they are. There are still some elements for us where we would have some questions as to what is the purpose, perhaps, of having some of that in there, as well as some elements perhaps that could be streamlined a little bit better. For instance, in the request for the SAP, we see that they should provide information on atmospheric measurements of all trace gases relevant to the Montreal Protocol, including controlled substance, non-controlled substances. And then we have another paragraph that seems to say that they should look at all halogenated gases, including N2O, DCM, and other ones. And we're just kind of wondering maybe if some of that could be streamlined, or if there's particular reasons why we want to identify specific gases. Our preferred approach is to provide, general direction to the SAP and the TEEP, perhaps not be too prescriptive, perhaps in terms of the substances, unless there's particular concern or, where we would want, because we know that, whatever we put there, they tend to provide us with a very comprehensive reports that cover all the substances that are of concern and all the sectors that are of concern anyways. So we think also, the delegation from China mentioned incorporating energy efficiency within the terms of reference. We think that's something probably important to think about at this stage. It is an issue which really has come to the foreground over the past few years. It is mentioned to some extent in these terms of reference, but I think that perhaps they could be reflected in a clearer and more significant way. So that's something that perhaps could also be discussed in the contact group. We also agree with Australia that it would be worth to consider the TEEP suggestion of whether to align the HFC alternatives reports with the quadrennial assessment. Whether this is addressed in this actual CRP or another decision, we're not sure. But we think that it is something that could be discussed, in parallel with this CRP, and then we can see what the way forward would be after we've had a discussion. So thank you, and just to note our interest in being part of a discussion in the contact group on this issue.
Thank you, Canada. And I think those items definitely can be taken up in a contact group further. Then I have USA on my list.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We appreciate the hard work of the assessment panels to put together these comprehensive reports for us every 4 years that inform us on the current state of science and technology. As we saw yesterday, there are a number of issues that were raised in the presentations and reports that it would be very interesting to receive further information on, such as the emerging area of solar radiation management and its effects on the environment and human health, skin cancer rates globally, and better information on atmospheric concentrations of chemicals such as HFC-23 and the effects of volcanic eruptions and supersonic flights on the ozone layer. We also think it would be interesting to receive further information on refrigerant management and information on banks recycling and reuse, and the use of HFCs, particularly in applications that do not have corresponding prior HCFC usages, such as electronics manufacturing. So thank you to the EU for putting this CRP forward. We look forward to discussing it further in a contact group with others and working cooperatively to ensure that the terms of reference for the 2026 quadrennial assessments will result in new reports that are, again, very comprehensive and contain useful and information for the parties. Thanks.
Thank you. And then the last speaker on my list is Brazil.
Thank you. Oh, now it's working. Thank you, Co-Chair. I would like to appreciate the work by the distinguished delegates from the EU for taking a step ahead and proposing a way forward in this item. I would echo some colleagues, especially from India, in their statements, so as to make an effort not to diversify our work here within the Montreal Protocol and end up addressing subjects that are already covered by other relevant conventions. We believe, as the Dominican Republic and others have mentioned, that we should focus on Article 5 parties' challenges and strengthening national implementation. This would be helpful for the implementation of this protocol, which surely is in all parties' interests. We look very much forward to more in-depth discussions in contact groups, but we felt that these points should be taken ahead for future discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. What I would like to conclude is there's a CRP. There is definitely also a request for a contact group, and I think it's good to arrange for this contact group because the good discussions can be put further in that context. The time and the venue will be put forward later on by the Secretary on the screen. But I also would like already to announce that the co-chairs of this contact group on the tour on the quadrennial assessment would be Cindy Newberg from the USA and Leslie Swit from Grenada. And indeed, as was said, it also would be good if the assessment panels would be in the room when the contact group takes place. And be prepared, it could be just before the reception. So I just announced that. The good thing, when you did hard work in the contact group, you immediately can go for some drinks and some food. So that's the carrot we can put for you. So be prepared for that if needed. So just would like to announce it. And now I would like to give the floor give it to my co-chair, Fideme.
Merci beaucoup, Raph. Un travail consistant a été déjà fait. Nous avons mis en place les groupes de contact. Nous allons maintenant poursuivre avec l'examen des autres composantes du point 3 de l'ordre du jour concernant l'évaluation quadriennale du protocole de Montréal de 2022. Nous allons précisément aborder le point 3B de l'ordre du jour qui concerne les informations sur la consommation et la production de HFC non inscrits à l'ANSF. En effet, dans la décision 29/12 prise par la 29e réunion des parties en 2017, il a été demandé au groupe d'évaluation de fournir dans leurs rapports quadriennaux à compter de 2023 des informations sur la consommation et la production des HFC non inscrits à l'ANSF du protocole dont le potentiel de réchauffement planétaire n'est pas inférieur au potentiel de réchauffement planétaire le plus faible des HFC inscrits à l'ANES-F, et ceci à titre d'information uniquement. Cette question a été principalement abordée par le comité des options techniques pour les produits médicaux et chimiques dans son évaluation quadriennale, et nous avions déjà suivi leur présentation déjà hier. Un résumé des informations est également fourni dans l'addendum 1 de la note du secrétariat dans le document 45/2 ADD.1. J'aimerais maintenant ouvrir une session de discussion sur ces questions et récolter les observations pertinentes. Qui voudrait prendre la parole? La parole circule. Je vous en prie. Je vois déjà, c'est le Switzerland qui manifeste une prise de parole. Switzerland, vous avez la parole, je vous en prie.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. And since this is the first time that this delegation takes the floor, we would like to thank the government of Thailand for its hospitality. We appreciate to be here in this country with its amazing people and its warm evenings. In particular, since this time I didn't forget to bring my short trousers. So we also thank the Ozone Secretariat for its great enthusiasm it's showing, and it's providing all the support that we need to do our work efficiently. We would like to acknowledge the assessment panels for their outstanding work and for taking up this specific issue that Norway and Switzerland have suggested back in 2017 and which the parties have deemed important. The good news that we saw from the report is that there seems only minor production and use on HFC not listed currently under Annex F, such as intermediates and solvents. The solvent uses, even if they are minor, might have replacements, and we are keen on learning about this in the next quadrennial report at the latest. In 2017, the parties took the prudent decision to take a look at this issue at a regular basis, so the parties, the Montreal Protocol, would not be caught by surprise. We have noted that in its response to decision 29/12, TEEP has provided information on fluorinated gases that are not HFC and which may be relevant in terms of their impact to climate change. We are interested in the thoughts that parties have in view of this information, and we are happy to engage in discussions in the course of this week. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, honorable délégué de Suisse-Land. Je donne la parole à l'Inde. Inde, je vous en prie, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We would like to thank the panels for presenting the information on consumption and production of HFCs not listed in Annex F to the Montreal Protocol. We have noted a number of points. We have noted that 13 HFCs and 1 HF4 having values greater than the threshold of GWP53. Out of these, 6 have known commercial use. It was also noted by the TEEP that 5 HFCs listed in Annex F to the Montreal Protocol have not had significant commercial use. So it has also been pointed out by TEEP that HFCs have been used as inhalation anesthetics. We would like to understand from the panels what would be the implication of above points on the implementation of HFC phased down by parties, especially the Article 5 parties. We would also like to understand from the TEEP on the extent of commercial use and expected growth of the 13 HFCs identified, particularly the 6 HFCs which have commercial use. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué de l'Inde. Norway, vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We would like to thank the panel for their efforts in providing this information. Obviously, we are concerned to hear the panel reporting that substances with quite significant GWP values appear to be in commercial use. Either those substances are HFCs, but also other fluorinated substances such as HFC and PFCs. Even though the volume seems to be not substantial, we have concerns about how this might affect the environment and global warming. And we are interested in knowing more about how this could affect further the environment and global warming, and also if the panel foresees how those uses might evolve in the next years to come. In our views, this shows the relevance and importance of this decision taken back in 2017, and the pertinence of asking the panels to keep an eye on the development of new high GWP level substances. We will definitely look carefully to the new information to be provided by the panel in the 4 years to come. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Il y a deux interventions que je vois. Il y a l'Union européenne et le Sénégal qui sollicitent la parole. Je donne la parole à l'Union européenne pour son intervention, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and we thank again the assessment panel for the comprehensive work on this item. We note that there are a number of substances beyond the controlled substances that are relevant in terms of ozone layer and the climate and used in relevant quantities that lead to emissions. PFCs, HFEs, or ethers, HFOs, we thank you very much for raising these issues, and we may want to come back to some of these substances. Certainly further monitoring will be important. We do regulate these substances in the EU under our F-gas regulation. Similar, we are on the verge of passing new legislation that will be banning SF6 in all new switchgear in the period 2026 to 2032. We will also be domestically addressing inhalation anesthetics by requiring that measures are taken to prevent emissions in recapture systems that should be used. So we would be very happy to communicate further on these measures that we're taking to reduce such emissions. We also note that 3 HFCs are mentioned that require further monitoring, as highlighted by the panel. So we would certainly support that this is done, and that we need to keep an eye on these various substances and their relevance for this protocol. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à l'Union européenne. Sénégal, vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Monsieur le co-chair, hier, lors de la présentation des experts du TIAP et des autres entités, il a été question sur les inhalateurs doseurs concernant par exemple les asthmatiques. Il a été mentionné qu'il existe des alternatives, mais la question qu'on a posée, quelles sont ces alternatives? Mais jusqu'à maintenant, on n'a pas eu d'éléments de réponse. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Nous avions eu des pays qui ont intervenu sur la question. La tendance qui se dégage, c'est que les parties ont besoin d'informations, des informations complémentaires pour mieux cerner certains domaines. Et pour ce faire, nous allons demander au comité des options techniques pour les produits médicaux et chimiques de s'appesantir sur ces points qui sont soulevés et de nous apporter des éléments d'éclaircissement. Donc, les différentes préoccupations sont bien notées et les informations additionnelles vous seront apportées. Donc, à présent, nous allons poursuivre avec le point 3C. Nous allons poursuivre avec le point 3C, qui est relatif à l'information sur les disponibilités de HFC. S'agissant du point 3C, rappelons que dans la décision 30/2, prise par la 30e réunion des parties en 2018, les parties ont demandé au GETE de fournir dans ses rapports quadriennaux qui seront présentés en 2023 et 2027 des informations sur la disponibilité des HCFC. Selon la décision, les informations devaient également inclure les quantités disponibles issues de la récupération, du recyclage et de la régénération et les meilleures informations disponibles sur les stocks nationaux et totaux connus, ainsi que la disponibilité d'options alternatives pour les applications décrites à l'annexe 2F, paragraphes 6A et 6B, qui sont liées à la fin de vie, fin de service, admissible après l'achèvement de l'élimination des HCFC. La réponse à la décision 30/2 est incluse dans le chapitre 3 du rapport quadriennal du GETE et est également résumée dans l'addendum 1 de la note du secrétariat, document 45/2/ADD.1. Nous avions suivi les présentations très enrichissantes du GETE de ses cotes, y compris le résumé de la réponse à la décision 30/2. Les délégués peuvent maintenant demander la parole pour des interventions sur des questions précises. La séance est ouverte. La parole circule. Le comité MBTOC est dans la salle. Le comité des options techniques pour les produits médicaux et chimiques. Oui, yes. OK. Vous pouvez aller apporter des éléments pour répondre déjà à la question de l'Inde. Donc, je vais donner la parole d'abord à l'Inde et après la parole au comité des options médicaux. La parole, l'Inde, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We would like to thank TEEP for highlighting the uses of HCFCs available from recovery, recycling, and reclamation in the RAC, fire suppression, rocket engine manufacturing, and medical aerosol applications. We would like to understand from TIP how effective the recycled HCFCs be for use in the above said sectors, especially the use of recovered HCFC 123 in firefighting and medical aerosols. We would also like to understand whether TIP has examined any industry experiences on the use of the recycled HCFCs, more specifically in the firefighting and medical aerosols applications. Lastly, we would also like to understand whether the mechanisms of management of the stockpiles of HCFCs as compared to other ODSs. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup à l'Inde. Donc la préoccupation est toujours là. Nous allons demander à l'MCTOC de nous apporter des éléments de clarification concernant certaines utilisations de ces substances-là. MCTOC, je vous en prie.
Thank you for the question from India, which covers both firefighting with the fire suppression TOC and also the medical and chemicals TOC, and I'll kind of briefly respond on both. In terms of recycling HCFCs, in all of those applications, as long as the HCFCs can be recovered, recycled, and can meet specifications, they can be reused. I don't know if that responds to the question, but recycling is generally not a barrier, for example, for fire protection, as long as those specifications can be met, which is usually possible.
Merci beaucoup. Nous avons entendu MC Tok qui a apporté des éléments de réponse. Mais ma foi, moi je reste sur ma soif. Est-ce qu'on peut creuser mieux? Donc, nous allons laisser le MC qui vont se consulter et nous apporter des éléments de réponse par rapport à la question de la réduction progressive des HFC et notamment l'impact de cette réduction sur le financement accordé aux pays visés à l'article 5. Donc, est-ce que vous avez des éléments à apporter par rapport à ça?
Sorry, didn't realise I had the microphone. Apologies, Co-Chair, but I'm not quite sure I understand the question, whether that is that question related to the HCFC's agenda item or the previous question from India on the previous agenda item, which was 3B. I'm a bit confused. Thank you.
Oui, nous voudrons savoir quelles sont les implications des 6 HFC qui ont été listés, leur implication dans le domaine de l'utilisation commerciale. Donc, nous allons vous accorder un peu de temps pour que vous puissiez collecter les informations nécessaires. En attendant, je vais ouvrir une autre liste d'interventions. Je vais donner la parole aux États-Unis pour que les États-Unis puissent réagir et nous apporter des informations, ou bien c'est une question. Les États-Unis, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Co-Chair. What I was going to say, and I'm not sure if I should say it because there's others taking the floor, but it didn't seem like there were additional interventions or questions, and we were just going to suggest at that point that perhaps what we would do is take note of the information that has been provided us by the TEEP. We could close the item for purposes of the open-ended working group, and if there were further, if there was a desire for further discussions, those could be taken up on the margins. Now, I think there are other speakers in the queue, so that may not work, but absent that, I think this body has been informed helpfully by the report that was provided by the TEEP. I was a little confused by your last comment that I thought pertained more to 3B than 3C, but perhaps I didn't understand that. And that was another question I had, is whether we had closed 3B for this meeting based on what you had said a few minutes ago. So that might be just a question of clarification for you as to whether we had closed 3B for purposes of this meeting, which is, as far as we're concerned, based on the discussion, would have been the appropriate thing to do. So I'll leave it there. Perhaps, so my suggestion had been, we would take note of the TEEP's report. We could close this issue for this meeting, but of course, if the interventions that follow mine suggest a different path, then we're quite open to how we proceed on this. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué des États-Unis. Effectivement, le point 3B a été clôturé. Nous avons abordé par la suite le point 3C et nous sommes actuellement au niveau du point 3C. Nous allons donner la parole au Myanmar pour son intervention.
Okay, thank you, Co-Chair. So regarding the assessment, so according to my understanding, I would like to take this information. So when we are currently preparing to send out the HFC and methane bromide data, as requested by the Ozone Secretary, as we are preparing to endorse the Kigali Amendment. Due to lack of the funding for data collection or the HFC and methane bromide inventory of legally and illegally imported by multi-stakeholders, we are worried about that HFC baseline data calculated by establishing HFC and methane bromide volunteer data assessment or inventory teams. So we are facing with technical and data fulfillment requirements from all stakeholders. We noted that HFC baseline data calculation will include 65% of HCFC use. But actually, HCFC baseline data for us is very less than what we needed in use due to technical and cooperation among the different stakeholders. And they are worried to express illegally imported data, methane bromide as well. We are still need more due to agriculture crop by our country's demand. But we strictly encourage the stakeholders to use it only in QBS. So thank you for sharing.
Merci. Nous avions accueilli l'honorable délégué de Myanmar. Ça semble plutôt être comme une déclaration. Et nous accueillons bien votre déclaration, c'est bien noté. Nous donnons la parole au Canada pour son intervention.
Merci, Monsieur le coprésident. Nous apprécions l'information du groupe d'évaluation technique et économique sur la disponibilité des HCFC. Ce rapport avait été demandé par la décision 32 qui a adopté un ajustement sur les HCFC. Je pense que ce rapport est intéressant et nous l'apprécions. Il ne contient pas des informations qui demanderaient aux parties de considérer une décision. Donc, en effet, comme vous le suggérez, nous pouvons noter les commentaires et nous pensons que ce sujet pourrait être fermé à ce stade. Merci.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué du Canada. Donc, nous avons fait le tour de la question. Il n'y a pas de déclaration pertinente. Donc, nous allons clore ce point et nous allons évoluer. Donc, le point 3C est clôturé et nous allons évoluer pour prendre le point 3D. Le point 3D qui concerne la mise à jour du rapport du panel du groupe de l'évaluation technique et économique sur les informations relatives aux solutions de remplacement des hydrofluorocarbones, la décision 28/2. Sur ce point, il s'agit d'une décision qui a été adoptée à la MOP 28 à Kigali. À cet effet, le GETE a été chargé de procéder à des examens périodiques des solutions de remplacement des HFC. Le premier examen devait être présenté en 2022 et tous les 5 ans par la suite, en utilisant des critères énoncés au paragraphe 1 de la décision 26/9. Le GETE a été prié de fournir des évaluations technologiques et économiques des solutions de remplacement les plus récentes et émergentes concernant les HFC. Déjà en 2022, le groupe d'experts avait estimé que les parties avaient également formulé une demande similaire d'examen des solutions de remplacement des HFC au paragraphe 6 de la décision 31/2 qui définissait le mandat du rapport d'évaluation quadriennal du groupe d'experts pour 2022. Mais le groupe d'experts ne voyait pas clairement comment cette demande faisait le lien d'un examen demandé, le lien avec l'examen demandé au titre de la décision 28/2. Donc, le groupe voudrait bien faire le travail, mais ne voyait pas la synergie entre les demandes qui sont faites au niveau des deux décisions. Néanmoins, pour permettre aux parties d'examiner la question en 2022, lors de la 34e MOP, le panel a formé un groupe de travail et a préparé un rapport dans le volume 5 du rapport 2022 du panel. Un extrait d'informations pertinentes sur les alternatives au HFC a été compilé en avant-première des rapports d'évaluation quadriennaux 2022 des cotes qui étaient en préparation à l'époque. Les rapports d'évaluation quadriennaux du GETE et de ses cotes présentés lors de la séance d'hier contiennent des informations actualisées sur les solutions de remplacement des HFC dans tous les secteurs concernés. Un résumé est également inclus dans l'addendum 1 de la note du secrétariat, document 45/2, ADD.1. Au cours de la MOP, les parties ont également discuté de la question de l'alignement de l'examen périodique des alternatives au HFC avec la préparation des rapports d'évaluation quadriennaux. Ils ont estimé qu'en alignant le calendrier de ces rapports et en présentant lors de la réunion du groupe de travail à composition non limitée, plutôt qu'à la MOP, les parties auraient plus de temps pour examiner le rapport avant la réunion des parties. Il a été souligné que l'examen périodique des solutions de remplacement des HFC devait rester un point distinct à l'ordre du jour des réunions afin de préserver l'esprit de la décision 28/2. Les parties ont convenu de reporter l'examen de cette question d'alignement à cette année. Ainsi, à présent, les parties souhaiteraient peut-être discuter des informations actualisées sur les solutions de remplacement des HFC présentées par le panel et ses TOC, ainsi que sur la question de l'éventuelle harmonisation des futurs examens périodiques et des rapports d'évaluation quadriennaux. Les représentants du GETE déjà sont là, mais ils peuvent toujours apporter des éclaircissements et des informations supplémentaires si nécessaire. Les membres sont appelés à apporter des réponses aux préoccupations qui seront ensuite soulevées. Donc, je donne la parole s'il y a des interventions, s'il y a des manifestations pour mieux comprendre les choses. Je donne la parole maintenant aux intervenants. Il y a le Sénégal.
Merci, Monsieur le Co-président, et nos remerciements aux éminents experts qui nous ont présenté le rapport. Sur les solutions de remplacement, sur les petits systèmes, ce qui se dessine, par exemple, sur les splits, c'est le propane, le R290. Mais se pose un problème majeur, c'est faible comme potentiel de réchauffement global, zéro potentiel de destruction de l'ozone, ça c'est connu, mais il y a une contrainte majeure, c'est son inflammabilité. Et tout récemment, on a eu à visiter un grand institut de recherche scientifique et des cas pratiques, et on a vu la vitesse, la cinétique du propane en termes d'inflammabilité. Donc, il y aura un besoin de renforcement des capacités de formation sur la certification, sur les standards, sur les normes et la labellisation. Parce que le problème, ce n'est pas uniquement les réfrigérants, mais c'est aussi les équipements. L'autre élément, c'est sur le secteur commercial. Qu'est-ce qu'il y a comme solution en lieu et place des HFC? et surtout aussi sur le secteur industriel, là où il y a les grands systèmes. Quelles sont les limites de ces solutions de remplacement? Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup au Sénégal. La préoccupation, votre préoccupation est allée aux substances qui sont inflammables et qui sont identifiées comme alternatives. Il faut prendre des mesures pour pouvoir faciliter l'utilisation de ces produits-là, pour que l'on puisse avoir la sûreté et la sécurité dans leur utilisation. D'accord, c'est bien noté. Je vais donner la parole à l'honorable délégué de l'Inde pour son intervention.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Availability of low GWP alternatives to HFCs is still a challenge for most applications, mainly in the refrigeration and air conditioning sector, considering the technical feasibility, economic viability, and safety-related issues, especially for the manufacturing sectors. So we would like to understand more from the TEEP on the way forward on this. Secondly, we feel the issue is more significant in halogens. We would like to understand more from the Fire Suppression Technical Options Committee the experiences of industry, including those of the ICAO, on the extent of low GWP alternatives to halogens and how to organize procedures to manage the introduction of such alternatives. Regarding the alignment of the two decisions, our preference would be to go as per decision 28/2, as it was a conscious decision during the Kigali negotiations. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué de l'Inde. Nous allons recueillir les questions et après nous allons donner la parole au GETE afin qu'ils puissent nous apporter des réponses. Je vois, il y a plusieurs pays qui sollicitent la parole. Il y a le Canada, l'Union européenne, il y a le Cameroun. Le Canada, s'il vous plaît. Je vous en prie.
Oui, merci. Well, we'd like to thank the TEEP for its reports on alternatives to HFCs. This is an update to the report we considered at the meeting of the parties last year, so we don't have many additional comments to make. We think it's quite comprehensive and provides significant information on, if not all, probably most of the alternatives available in all the different sectors and subsectors. The one thing I would say is that sometimes indeed when there are many alternatives, it becomes a little bit confusing. And what would be really useful for us is to have perhaps more indication in a future report with respect to the penetration of these alternatives. So for instance, if we look just at food retail and food service refrigeration, which is a key sector, there are about 20 alternatives that are listed there. Most of them it's indicated available, a couple of them are not available. But what would be really useful for us is to understand a little bit more, are these really being used in a significant way in some countries, or they're just there but nobody is using them? Or perhaps, yes, they're widely used in non-A5 countries, but for some reasons they're not used in A5 countries. So, more of this kind of market information, I think, would be useful for us and for parties in terms of understanding which specific alternatives perhaps could be more promising, and which ones they could be paying attention more in terms of planning the phase down in their respective countries. So that's just one comment, but overall we're satisfied with the report. With respect to the issue of whether these reports, this next report should be aligned with the next quadrennial assessment. That is, instead of coming in 2027, whether it could come with the 2026 quadrennial assessments. Ostensibly, we were favorable to that because we understood from the TEEP that this would really facilitate its work and reduce some overlap in how it undertakes this work. However, we're conscious that we just heard from the delegation from India that they would prefer to keep the schedule that was decided under decision 28/2. So I guess we have some flexibility. We note that Australia and ourselves suggested that we could discuss this issue in the contact group that was formed in the terms of reference for the areas of focus for the next quadrennial assessment. So perhaps we can just withhold taking a decision right now on the issue of the timing for the next report. We can have maybe a little bit of discussion on this issue in the contact group and at some point come back. So as I indicated, we are fairly flexible on this issue, but we're always mindful of the burden of work that we're putting on the panels. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué du Canada qui a fait d'excellentes contributions et merci beaucoup. Nous allons donner la parole à l'Union européenne. Mais avant cela, je voudrais préciser que nous avons ces pays qui demandent la parole. Nous avons le Cameroun, la Colombie, Trinidad et Tobago. Donc après l'intervention de Trinidad et Tobago, nous allons clore la liste et poursuivre. Il y a aussi l'Australie qui vient de s'ajouter. Donc nous prenons l'Australie à titre des options. Nous prenons l'Australie. Ah, il y a les États-Unis qui se sont ajoutés. La liste ne faut que s'allonger. Bon. Nous allons prendre ces pays-là, nous allons prendre le Cameroun, la Colombie, Trinidad, l'Australie et les États-Unis. Je vous remercie. Union européenne, vous avez la parole.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We welcome the report. We find it really interesting. It gives a wealth of information of the types of alternatives available to HFCs. It goes in great detail. And as such, I think it indicates that many options are there. I would agree with the delegate of Canada that indicated that a future version of the report could go a bit more into, you could say, the amount of deployment and then the related challenges or even opportunities and why potentially in certain areas it's picked up faster than not. Is it technical issues? Is it maybe that the policy environment stimulates a different take-up? I mean, that kind of information is certainly of relevance, I would say, for policymakers to see if and how they can see certain alternatives penetrate into their markets. We have a technical question for TIAP, having read the report. We have seen a few changes to the version we discussed last year, and the report now recognizes that for air-to-air conditioners and related heat pumps, R290 can be used, also in split systems. In the EU, we've seen very fast developments in this context, notably for monoblocks, monoblock heat pumps for domestic use, which are now offered quite large in 390 versions, R290 versions. Nevertheless, we are a bit surprised to read that for heating-only heat pumps, the report concludes that the use of propane is restricted to outdoor monoblocks only. And we wonder why the TIAP concludes that. Is that because there are no such products available in the EU market and other markets, or is it because they see a technical limitation? Finally, regarding the question on synchronization, we see merit in helping TIAP maybe to synchronize their work. So in that way, we are certainly open for seeing if we can help the timing of the work. we're also in your hands to see how and where to discuss this. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup à l'Union européenne. Je donne la parole au Cameroun.
Very much, Co-Chair. Since Cameroon is taking the floor for the first time, I want to use the opportunity to thank the government of Thailand and also the Secretariat for organizing this very interesting meeting. But I also want to use this opportunity to express kind of a plea. The plea will be for the government of Thailand to ease the issuance of visa for parties, especially when they have such meetings, because it becomes a bit difficult for some parties to leave countries to visit because of issues of visas making about 2 to 3 or 4 or 5 days because they need to have visas. Please, we just wish that the Secretariat should pass this information to the government of Thai to ease maybe e-visa. I want to come back on the issue of this paper. This is very important. We know very well that the replacement of HFC has been a problem, or we call it recently development. The case of 600 and even 290 propane that we see most of the time, but you have a series of problems so far. Not only about the flammability, but I think one of the issues that we notice exactly is the level of accessibility, and as well as most of these products are very, very expensive. So we're just maybe asking the TEP to look at more information on the market of these substances that can make it available. And I will want to add exactly my comment on what Senegal actually added, that we need more training of technicians in this sector, especially if we have to consider the issue of bringing in substance at the level of the industrial setting. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué du Cameroun. Je vais prier ceux qui sont sur la liste d'être brefs et concis, parce que le temps nous talonne déjà. Je donne la parole à la Colombie. Colombie, s'il vous plaît.
Gracias, señor presidente. Como es la primera vez que intervenimos, agradecemos al Reino de Tailandia por haber recibido esta reunión y a la Secretaría del Ozono por habernos ayudado en la preparación de todas las actividades de esta reunión para nuestro éxito en el trabajo. Señor presidente, Colombia agradece al TIAP por confirmar los hallazgos del informe del 2022. Sin embargo, frente a algunos planteamientos, no queremos dejar pasar la oportunidad de expresar nuestra preocupación sobre las situaciones que enfrentamos los países para orientar a nuestros sectores productivos. Aún los sectores no tienen un panorama claro de transición o definitivo. Se debaten entre diferentes alternativas, buscando aquellas que brinden la oportunidad de ser las más ambientalmente sostenibles y las que estén disponibles en el mercado local. En el sector de RAC, los factores como la inflamabilidad, la toxicidad y las condiciones de funcionamiento con altas presiones, más la disponibilidad, son aspectos que continúan limitando la disposición de alternativas. Por otra parte, es muy preocupante que en la última reunión del Comité Ejecutivo del Fondo Multilateral, aproximadamente 109 proyectos financiados por el fondo se encuentren atrasados. Si bien parte de estos atrasos obedecen a factores administrativos, no podemos desconocer que muchos de ellos se originan por la escasez de suministros en los mercados locales y globales, y en algunos casos los países han tenido que pedir permisos transitorios para continuar usando las alternativas de alto potencial de calentamiento global. Según el informe del TIAP, estos problemas de suministro son menos graves son de menor gravedad ahora, lo cual no es coherente con la realidad y la dinámica de los proyectos que estamos ejecutando en los países. Preguntamos al TIA si para plantear los análisis de este informe ha revisado los progresos de los proyectos financiados por el Fondo Multilateral para tener un panorama claro de las alternativas que se están dando en los países. En especial, queremos llamar la atención sobre los desafíos que continúan en el sector de espumas. Colombia siempre ha sido muy comprometida en la evaluación de alternativas y desde un principio brindó su apoyo para generar proyectos demostrativos en el sector de espumas de alternativas de bajo potencial de calentamiento global. Sin embargo, después de más de 6 años, vemos con preocupación que estos desafíos continúan y que efectivamente están afectando a nuestros países y llevando principalmente a las MIPYMES, a las empresas medianas y pequeñas, a una situación de insostenibilidad por los altos precios de los HFOs y por su incapacidad de manejar alternativas inflamables. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Merci à la Colombie. Je voudrais encore repréciser, soyez bref et concis. Je donne la parole à la Trinidad et Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. As this is the first time my delegation is taking the floor, we would like to thank the Ozone Secretariat for the excellent organization of this meeting, as well as the government of Thailand for its warm and generous hospitality. On behalf of my delegation, we would also like to extend our deepest gratitude to the TEEP and other technical experts for their invaluable contributions to the reports available on the Ozone Secretariat webpage. These reports provide a wealth of information and insight on the issues at hand, and we are grateful for their experience and their expertise and dedication of the individuals involved. As we approach the January 1st, 2024 implementation of the HFC freeze under the Kigali Amendment, Trinidad and Tobago is cognizant that there are certain limitations to the alternatives within the fire suppression sector. This delegation would like to request additional information on low GWP alternatives to the current HFCs used within the fire sector. In particular, HFC 227 or FM 200, which was originally created to substitute halon gas. Additionally, we were made aware that a major manufacturer of FM 200 will be halting the production of this substance within the upcoming years due to the PFAS issue. Though they have other substances such as Novec 1230 that can be used in other safety equipment, this is not suitable to service the build capacity of HFCs. Given that the transition away from halons in safety equipment was substantially large, we would like to request some more information for alternatives of HFC 227 to service these type of equipments. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Merci. Australie.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. First of all, this delegation would like to thank and congratulate the TEEP for this report. It is very, very useful for us. It's a first report. Of course, there will be refinements as we go along, and of course, there will be new things that we discover that we need to know about. We take note of the interventions already made by a number of delegations, including Canada and the EU, particularly on the usefulness of including penetration rates in future reports, as well as potential barriers to penetration. I also note the very useful comment just made from Trinidad about the use and availability of alternatives to halon, and in fact even alternatives to some of the existing HFCs. So additional information in that area, particularly on 227, would be very useful to the parties. I just also wanted to refer back to an intervention this delegation made on one of the previous agenda items about considering aligning this report or integrating this report with the quadrennial assessment reports. We had a discussion of that last year. We didn't come to a landing on it. I think there was, probably as we are now, there's a degree of interest in doing this, as well as a little bit of hesitation, given that there was a conscious decision made when we struck the Kigali amendment. We're interested in seeing the merger occur just simply from the point of view of efficiency and getting our information at the one time, but we're also sensitive to the needs of others on this. We're flexible. As I said, we have a preference, but we suggest that it'd be worthwhile continuing this discussion on the possible merger of the reports as part of the terms of reference. And as I think Canada suggested, that we could maybe return to this item a little bit later, depending on the progress that's made in the terms of reference. But I would emphasise we have a preference, but we are certainly flexible and we're sensitive to the needs of other parties. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Nous remercions l'honorable délégué de l'Australie qui a bien posé le contexte dont il est question ici, la question de l'alignement et de l'examen de la périodicité. Le contexte est bien posé et nous pensons qu'il faut que vous nous appuyiez. Nous avons besoin des parties pour mieux comprendre les choses, pour faire les activités, les réunions, apporter des solutions adéquates. Donc nous avons besoin de vous pour travailler à cet effet. Je vais donner la parole aux États-Unis. C'est la liste qui est ainsi clôturée.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and I will be brief. Just to say, so our understanding is that the discussion today relates to our agreement last year to defer consideration of the issue of sort of the possible alignment of timing of future periodic reviews. So in that context, I just want to make one procedural point, is I just think it's important if this body does make a decision on that that's different than what is in decision 28.2 paragraph 4. I just want to make sure that it is clear that we are explicitly making an adjustment to that. So if, I think the idea of some is probably just to have, you know, some language in the terms of reference for the next quad report. And I just want to make sure we don't leave, should that be the path chosen, I want to make sure we don't leave any ambiguity as to whether that is additional to or a replacement of the review outlined in 28.2 para 4. So I just wanted to raise that procedural issue as something we'll want to be clear about. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué des États-Unis. Nous venons de clôturer la liste. Après avoir écouté les parties, nous pensons que la question d'alignement est une question qui est importante et qu'il faut en discuter maintenant au cours de cette réunion même. Et à cet effet, nous n'allons pas attendre encore. Les contextes sont déjà bien posés. Les éléments envisagés pour bien répondre à la question posée sont déjà là. Donc nous proposerons que cette question puisse être débattu parallèlement au niveau du groupe de contact qui sera mis en place pour le point 3E. Il y a un groupe de contact qui est mis en place par rapport au point 3E, donc le quadrennial assessment. Si on peut jumeler cette question à la question qui sera évoquée au niveau du quadrennial assessment pour qu'on puisse en discuter et faire ressortir des propositions pertinentes qui seront considérées. Donc, à présent, je pense que nous avons fait le tour des questions de la matinée. Nous nous acheminons vers la pause déjeuner et nous allons donc clôturer les travaux de cette matinée. Et avant de clôturer, nous vous remercions pour votre attention et vos diverses contributions, les questions qui sont venues, elles sont été très très pertinentes. D'autres ont été des questions qui ont fourni des points d'ancrage pour aller de l'avant sur des points divers. Donc nous allons clôturer et on reprend tout à l'heure à 15h. On reprend tout à l'heure à 15h. Bon appétit et n'oubliez pas de regarder les écrans pour les side events. Je vous remercie.